Spring planting is already well underway in our Zone 5 garden, and even though our last frost date is 6 weeks away, we're already planting outside. Today I'll plant potatoes and sugar snap peas outside under a single layer of cover. Let's get started with potatoes. Today I'm planting two early season potato varieties, Red Norland and Yukon Gold. These potatoes are typically ready to harvest in 65 days, but it might take a little bit longer than that at this time of the year because the sun is still fairly low in the sky and we don't have very high daylight hours. Even so, these potatoes should be ready to harvest by late spring. These are certified seed potatoes which we purchase locally, but we sometimes also plant potatoes from last year's harvest as well as organic potatoes from the grocery store. As you can see, these have just started to sprout, which makes it a perfect time to plant them. If your seed potatoes haven't started to sprout, you can encourage sprouting by placing them on a windowsill 4 to 6 weeks before planting. This process is called chitting. And because seed potatoes are about the size of an open egg carton is an excellent container to hold your potatoes in place on the windowsill during chitting. You can plant potatoes outside without any cover at all 3 weeks before your average last frost date. But using my rule of thumb of planting 3 weeks earlier than that with a single layer of cover, I can plant seed potatoes 6 weeks before my average last frost date under 1 layer of cover. As you can see, I mulched this bed heavily with leaves last fall. And what I'll do to plant is just brush the leaves to the side, dig out a little bit of soil. I want the potato to have at least 4 inches of soil and leaves above it. And because potatoes are heavy feeders, I'll also add some vermicompost to each planting hole. And there are lots of worms in here too because I'm too lazy to separate the worms out from the vermicompost. But that's not something you have to do, obviously. And you can also use compost instead of vermicompost. And about 10 inches away or so, I'll plant my next potato. I like to plant whole seed potatoes that are on the small side. But if you have larger seed potatoes, you can cut them into smaller sections about 1.5 inches thick, as long as you have at least 2 eyes per piece, and then plant those separate pieces instead of planting them whole. Now, each one of these seed potatoes can produce 5 to 10 potatoes. And as you can imagine, as they get bigger and bigger, they can bunch up and potentially poke through the soil surface as they grow. And this is something you want to prevent happening, because when potatoes are exposed to the sun, they'll turn green and they'll give you an upset stomach if you eat them. So this is why people hill potatoes by adding more soil around the potato plants as they grow. But instead of using soil, I just use mulch. So when these plants are about 8 to 12 inches tall, I'll simply add more leaf mulch around the plants so that they'll only have maybe 4 inches of plant above the mulch. One big advantage to starting your potatoes early in the season is that they do best in relatively cool soil temperatures. 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit is optimal. And they don't produce tubers well at all when the soil temperature is above 80 degrees. This will give your potatoes plenty of time to grow before the soil is too warm for optimal tuber production. Mulch also helps a great deal to keep the soil temperature cool, and this will help your potatoes grow. Not only keeps your soil cool, it also helps to keep the soil moist. Potatoes don't do well when the soil moisture level changes a great deal. In other words, it gets too dry or too wet. And mulch helps to keep the moisture level in the soil more consistent. The potatoes prefer slightly acidic soil. Our soil is slightly alkaline, but they still grow well. Okay, that's the last of the Red Norlands. Now I'll plant the Yukon Golds using the same approach, and I'll get back to you when I'm finished. Okay, I'm done planting our early season Red Norland and Yukon Gold potatoes, which will be ready to harvest this spring. In addition, we'll be planting more varieties in April and May, and this will give us a continuous harvest of potatoes starting in spring and ending in late summer. Now, a couple points I wanted to make before planting our sugar snap peas. The first is we'll be covering the potatoes with 6 mil greenhouse plastic. And the second point is we're using leaves as mulch because they're free and readily available. But straw is probably a better option. So if you have a free resource of straw in your area, I'd go with straw. Now let's plant some sugar snap peas. Sugar snap peas can be started without cover about 5 weeks before your average last frost date. But they can be started earlier than that, under cover. 3 weeks earlier than that with a single layer, or 6 weeks earlier with 2 layers. Now I started some in mid-February, and now I can start more in mid-March. In mid-February I had to use 2 layers, now I only need 1. So let's get started planting. I followed a square foot garden spacing of 8 peas per foot, and they'll be planted along the north side of the bed. And I'll actually have 2 rows of 4, as you can see right here. I plant the peas about 1 inch deep. I'll only plant 1 per hole because these are brand new seeds. If some of them don't come up, I'll just come back later and plant more peas. And just cover them up and tamp down the soil. In our experience, the peas that we plant in mid-February under double cover are ready to harvest just a little bit earlier than the ones we start under single cover in March. But we'll be harvesting peas starting in May and usually through July. We'll remove the cover around our average last frost date. And at that point we'll also install a trellis for the peas to climb. They tend to grow quite tall here, usually about 7 feet high or so at least. And after I finish planting the peas, I just cover them up with soil and tamp the soil down a bit. I have a little bit of vermicompost left over, so I'll apply that as well to feed the peas. I just apply the vermicompost to the soil surface. I don't work it into the soil at all. And that finishes our planting for today. Well, I hope you enjoyed joining me today as I planted potatoes and sugar snap peas outside in Zone 5 in mid-March under single cover. I have a lot more to plant this month, and hopefully I'll be back tomorrow to plant turnips, carrots, and beets under cold frames. I hope to see you then. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe for more videos on how to grow a lot of food on a little land without spending much or working harder than you have to.